The hills outside São João del Rei rolled like waves frozen in emerald stone, their slopes covered with pasture so lush it seemed painted rather than grown. Nestled in the folds of those hills was Fazenda Santa Helena, a property that locals described with hushed admiration and silent resentment. From the road, it looked like a kingdom of order and prosperity. White fences stretched for miles, horses grazed behind them, and the stables gleamed with imported wood and polished brass. To visitors, it was a monument to success. To those who worked there, it was something colder, a machine that cared only for profit. At the center of this machine stood Eduardo Villela, heir to the Villela dynasty. His father had been a man of warmth and instinct, a breeder who spoke to his animals as though they were family, and built his reputation on trust as much as on bloodlines. Eduardo, however, had inherited only the land, the wealth, and the cold arithmetic of profit. His clothes were immaculate, his boots shone even in the dust, and his eyes, shielded by dark glasses most days, measured every creature like a flawed piece of merchandise. Eduardo carried himself with the confidence of a man used to obedience. His word was law on Santa Helena. When he walked into a room, silence settled. When he issued a command, men jumped to obey. Some said he loved his horses, but those who labored day and night knew better. He loved what they could bring him, trophies, prestige, and money. The ranch pulsed with the rhythms of birth and sale, of foaling seasons and auctions. Each new life was weighed not by its fragility but by its potential to win, breed, and sell. Eduardo invested in stallions with prestigious bloodlines, mares with flawless conformation, and trainers who could turn raw energy into polished performance. But he had no patience for weakness. Horses that limped, colts that failed to grow strong, or mares deemed too old were dismissed, sold, or worse. To him, they were expenses masquerading as assets. It was in such a season, under a sun that had just begun to warm the pastures of spring, that Estrella gave birth. She was one of the oldest mares in the herd, known for her elegance and endurance. She had carried riders across long trails and weathered storms patiently, earning her quiet respect from the stable hands. Eduardo, however, had long ago judged her as past her usefulness. She was no longer bred, no longer shown. He considered her little more than a cost. Yet life moves beyond the boundaries men try to draw. On a quiet morning filled with the damp scent of hay and earth, Estrella lay down in her stall and delivered a colt. The foal was small but vibrant, his coat a gleaming shade of chestnut brown, his eyes wide with the light of beginnings. Stable hands gathered, their hardened faces softening in the presence of new life. They whispered words of wonder, hope, perhaps even relief that beauty could still emerge in a place so stern. Estrella nuzzled her newborn, guiding him with the patience of a mother, helping him rise on uncertain legs. The colt stumbled, fell, and tried again until he managed to stand, trembling but proud, pressing his nose into his mother's flank. In that fragile moment, there was no ranch, master, or ledger, only the quiet promise of love and survival. Then came Eduardo. He arrived with the usual display of power, his black truck cutting across the yard, his boots striking the concrete floor of the stable like a gavel. The stable hand stepped aside as he approached, his gaze fixed on the foal. Valmir, the old capataz who had worked under both father and son, cleared his throat. Male, senor. Small, but strong enough. And the color, Eduardo asked, his voice clipped. Brown, Valmir said. Eduardo's jaw hardened. His father might have said the coat shone like bronze under the morning sun, might have seen potential in the colt's spirit, but Eduardo saw only a defect. Buyers wanted bays, grays, blacks with sleek coats that caught the eye in parades and auctions. Brown meant ordinary. Brown meant difficult to sell. Another mouth to feed for nothing, Eduardo muttered. Move the colt to the back barns. Keep Estrella away. Valmir hesitated. She just gave birth, senor. At least let... Eduardo's voice sharpened. Are you questioning me, Valmir? The older man's shoulders sank. Now, senor. With a nod, Eduardo ended the conversation. His decision was final. Two stable hands stepped forward. They lifted the trembling colt from beside his mother. Estrella's reaction was immediate. She reared, snorting, her eyes rolling with terror, her nostrils flaring wide. She tugged against the rope tied to her halter, striking the ground with her hooves as though to split the earth. Her cries rose, raw and desperate, echoing through the rafters. The colt answered with a soft whinny, stretching his neck toward her, his legs kicking weakly in protest. The men carried him away, his small body twisted against their hold, his cries thin and sharp. Estrella lunged against her tether until her sides heaved, but the rope held. Her eyes followed them until the colt disappeared into the shadows. Her cries did not stop. They rolled across the ranch, across the white fences, into the hearts of those who dared to listen. The back barns were different from the polished stalls. They were colder, darker, forgotten corners of a place that prided itself on appearances. The bedding was thin and damp. The air carried the smell of mold and neglect. There the colt was placed, shivering, separated from the warmth of his mother's body. Instead of milk, he was offered feed mixed with water, a poor substitute for nourishment. Days passed. The colt grew weaker. He no longer lifted his head quickly at sounds, no longer tested his legs with eager steps. His eyes dulled, losing the spark that had once danced within them. Stable hands walked by, some glancing in pity, but none dared linger. Eduardo's orders were law, and disobedience was punished with dismissal, sometimes worse. Estrella remained in a distant paddock. Each morning and evening she lifted her head and called, her cries stretching across the fields. Workers spoke quietly of her grief, but no one dared bring her near her foal. They said a mother's heart never forgets, never stops searching. And though distance and ropes held her back, Estrella never stopped. The colt, nameless and neglected, became invisible. To Eduardo, he was a failed investment. To the workers, he was a burden they could not help. To his mother, he was still everything. And yet fate was not finished, for it was during one of those damp mornings when mist hung low over the fields and the dew clung to every blade of grass that Sophia arrived. She was young, barely in her 20s, with a face that carried both innocence and determination. She came seeking work, grateful for wages, unaware of the shadows hidden in the polished beauty of Santa Helena. Her eyes were keen, her heart softer than she led on. She did not yet know that her path would tangle with that of a colt without a name, and that together they would defy the silence of a place where money spoke louder than mercy. That morning, as the sun rose pale and hesitant, Sophia walked past the back barns. A sound cracked the air, a flat, sharp sound that no one could mistake. It was the sound of cruelty, the sound of despair meeting force. She froze, then stepped closer, heart pounding. What she saw planted a seed in her that nothing could erase, a seed that would grow into defiance, risk, and rescue. The story of the nameless colt had only just begun. The back barns of Santa Helena had always been places where shadows grew longer than light, where dust clung to every beam and the smell of damp wood pressed heavy against the chest. For most workers, they were spaces to pass through quickly, places that carried the cold weight of neglect. It was there, on her second morning, that Sophia stopped in her tracks when the sharp crack of a blow split the silence. Her broom fell against the wall as she froze. The sound had been unmistakable, not the slap of rope against wood, not the shuffle of boots in hay, but flesh meeting fragile resistance. With her heart climbing to her throat, she edged closer, slipping behind a stack of burlap sacks filled with grain. The air in her lungs felt trapped as she dared to look through the narrow gap. Inside the stall, Beto loomed like a storm. His hand shot forward, landing another strike across the muzzle of the small brown colt. The foal staggered back against the boards, his eyes wide with terror, legs shaking as though they might give way. Beto spat his frustration. "Stand, you lazy thing, or starve." His boot nudged the colt's frail body, and the little creature folded further into the corner. Sophia pressed her fist to her mouth to stop a cry from escaping. She had seen cruelty before, but never so blunt, never so casually delivered to something so defenseless. The scene cut into her with a blade sharper than any words could carry. She could feel her pulse drumming in her ears, her hands trembling with the kind of anger that demands action. But she was new, untested, a stranger on a ranch ruled by fear. When Beto finally left, muttering curses under his breath, Sophia waited until the echo of his boots had faded. Then she stepped forward, each footfall slow, cautious, as though the shadows themselves might betray her. She reached the stall door and leaned in. The colt had sunk against the rough boards, his breathing shallow, his eyes dulled not just by pain but by surrender. Sophia crouched, her voice barely more than a whisper. Your little one, I saw, I am so sorry." The colt lifted his head only slightly, as if the effort alone were too costly. His gaze met hers for a fleeting second before sliding away, but it was enough. Sophia stretched her hand forward, inch by inch, until her fingers brushed his muzzle. His skin quivered beneath her touch, but he did not pull back. It was the first gentle contact he had felt since birth. Tears blurred Sophia's vision. She blinked them away, pressing her palm more firmly against him. In that moment, she made a vow. Silent, but binding. She would not abandon him. That night, in her small room, she could not sleep. The cries of Estrella from the paddock carried through the night air, mingling with the memory of the blow she had witnessed. The sound filled her chest with an ache that burned. She opened the notebook she kept at her bedside, its pages already worn from years of her thoughts. With shaking hands, she wrote a single line: "I will protect him." Morning came with its usual demands. Workers moved briskly, stables needed cleaning, and horses needed feeding. Eduardo strode through the yard, speaking sharply into his phone, his words clipped and impatient. To the others, he was the master. To Sophia, he was the wall that stood between the colt and a life worth living. She carried her duties quietly, careful not to draw notice, but her mind was never far from the back barns. Each chance she found, she slipped away, bringing with her small tokens of care. A slice of banana was smuggled in her pocket, a handful of sweet hay, a brush she had found discarded in the tack room. The colt, still nameless to most, began to recognize her footsteps. At first, he only lifted his head. Then he began to shift slightly toward her, a gesture so subtle most would miss it, but to Sophia it was a victory. At dusk, she walked the paddock where Estrella was kept. The mare had grown thinner, her coat dull with worry, her cries less frequent but no less desperate. When Sophia approached, Estrella swung her head sharply, eyes wide, before softening at the girl's touch. Sophia pressed her forehead against the mare's muzzle. "He is hurting, but I am with him, I promise." The mare's breath came warm and heavy against her cheek, as if in answer. Still the weight of silence pressed down on Sophia. She wanted to speak, to call out the cruelty, to demand justice for the colt. But the ranch lived under Eduardo's shadow. Even Valmir, who had known better days under Eduardo's father, kept his words locked tight. One evening, as Sophia dared to mention what she had seen, Valmir shook his head. "Girl, keep your eyes closed if you want to last here. Eduardo's reach is more extended than you imagine." But Sophia's eyes could not close. She carried the image of the colt's trembling body with her everywhere. She replayed the moment when her hand touched his muzzle and his breathing calmed, even if only for a second. That connection was now a tether, binding her fate to his. The days turned to weeks. The colt grew thinner, his legs marked by minor bruises, his spirit dimming with each sunrise. Yet beneath it all a spark remained, fragile but unbroken, sustained only by the bond with his distant mother and the quiet care of the girl who refused to forget him. Sophia began to call him Bronze in whispers, because his coat, even in neglect, carried a shimmer that caught the light like metal. To everyone else he remained nothing, but to him he was someone worth saving. One afternoon, as the clouds thickened and rain threatened the horizon, Sophia entered the back barns with a brush in her hand. She sat on the floor near Bronze, close enough for him to reach her, but far enough not to frighten. Slowly, she began to stroke his coat. At first he flinched, but then he stood still, his eyes closing, his breathing deepening. The brush lifted dust and grime, revealing the faint gleam beneath. "You are not nothing," she whispered. "You are strong, You are worthy." The words fell into the silence like seeds, and though Bronze could not understand them, he felt the rhythm of her voice, the steadiness of her presence. For the first time since his birth, he relaxed enough to fold his legs and rest his head near her lap. Sophia held the brush still, her heart swelling with both pain and hope. Outside, the ranch moved as it always did, blind to the minor miracle happening in the shadows. Eduardo spoke of profits, Beto barked orders, and Valmir sighed beneath burdens he could not lay down. But within that stall, a promise grew stronger. The silent cry of a nameless colt had been heard, and the answer had arrived in the form of a young woman who carried defiance in her heart. Sophia did not yet know how far that defiance would take her, or how dangerous it would become. She did not see the cost that would be demanded of her, nor the battles she would face. But she knew this much: she would not turn away. And though Eduardo's shadow loomed large, though money ruled the ranch and fear silenced its workers, there were forces greater than fear: the love of a mother, the loyalty of a girl who had once been cast aside herself, and the unspoken resilience of a colt who refused to vanish quietly into the dark. The storm was only beginning, but in the heart of the back barns, the first light had been lit. The days following that first connection between Sophia and the colt unfolded with a quiet intensity that only she seemed to notice. To most of the workers, nothing had changed. Eduardo still strode across the courtyards with his polished boots and clipped orders. Valmir still carried the weight of obedience like a yoke across his shoulders. Beto still treated the back barns as his domain, a place where his cruelty went unchecked. But for Sophia, every dawn was different now. Each morning she woke before the others, her body stiff from the thin mattress of her room, but her spirit sharpened by determination. She moved through her chores with quiet efficiency, making sure not to draw unnecessary attention. But when she could, she slipped away to the shadows of the barns. Bronze awaited her there, a fragile figure huddled against the damp boards, his eyes still dulled by weeks of neglect. The first time she brushed him, his flinch had nearly broken her heart. The second time, his trembling lasted longer, but he did not retreat. By the third day, he allowed her to stroke his coat in silence. It was as though he was slowly remembering what gentleness could feel like, that hands did not always bring pain. Sophia's voice became a constant melody in his world. She spoke to him in whispers, telling him stories of her own life, stories she had never told another living soul. She told him about her childhood, about a father whose harshness had driven her from home before she was grown, about nights she had slept in cold rooms where kindness was absent. She told him about the strength she had found in surviving, in choosing to keep moving forward, even when every step felt heavy. Bronze could not understand her words, but he understood her tone, the steady rhythm of her voice that carried both sorrow and comfort. And still, Estrella cried. Each dawn, each dusk, her calls reached across the fields, echoing into the barns where her son lay hidden. Workers learned to ignore it, but Sophia never could. Each time she heard that desperate cry, she felt the ache deepen in her chest. It was not only the pain of separation, it was the cruelty of indifference, the deliberate tearing apart of a bond that was never meant to break. One evening, after finishing her chores, Sophia walked to Estrella's paddock. The mare paced restlessly, her eyes hollow with longing. Sophia leaned against the fence, her hands curled into fists. "He is alive," she whispered. "I'm watching over him." Her voice cracked, but Estrella's ears twitched as though she understood. The ranch carried on with its routines. Eduardo entertained visitors in the main house, discussing bloodlines and profits over glasses of imported wine. The men worked the fields, cleaning stalls, hauling hay, and training the stallions deemed worthy of attention. Yet beneath this facade of order, the cracks were spreading. Whispers carried through the workers' quarters, rumors of Bronze, rumors of the mare who would not stop crying, rumors of Sophia's defiance. Beto, sharp-eyed and cruel, began to notice. One afternoon, he entered the back barn and found Bronze chewing slowly on a piece of apple. His eyes narrowed. He knew he had not given it. His gaze swept across the stall, landing on the faint tracks of a brush in the dust. "Someone is meddling," he muttered, his fists clenched at his sides. That night, Sophia lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small room. She knew the risk she was taking. Eduardo would not tolerate disobedience, and Beto was the kind of man who thrived on punishment. But each time she thought of walking away, she remembered Bronze's trembling body leaning against her hand. She remembered the way Estrella pressed her muzzle into her palm. Some bonds, once formed, could not be broken by fear. The next morning, she carried a handful of carrots in her pocket. As she entered the barn, she found Beto already there, leaning against the stall door with a smirk curling his lips. "Looking for your little friend?" he asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. Sophia froze, her heart pounding, but forced her voice steady. "I was sent to clean." Beto's eyes studied her. For a moment, silence stretched heavy between them. Then he spat on the ground and walked away, muttering curses. Sophia waited until his footsteps faded before slipping into Bronze's stall. Her hands shook as she stroked his muzzle, whispering reassurance. "You are not alone," she told him. "I will not let them take everything from you." But even as she spoke, she knew the danger was growing. Eduardo's obsession with profit, Beto's suspicion, Valmir's silence, they were walls closing in. And yet, within those walls, Sophia felt her resolve sharpen. She would not let Bronze be swallowed by the shadows. As the days stretched into weeks, Bronze began to change. His legs grew stronger under Sophia's careful attention, his eyes a little brighter each time she arrived. The bruises remained, the hunger still gnawed at his ribs, but hope flickered where once there had been none. He began to nicker softly when he heard her footsteps, a sound that filled her chest with both joy and sorrow. Still, the storm was building. Eduardo was becoming impatient. Buyers demanded champions, not cast-offs. He summoned Valmir one evening, his voice cold. "That colt, the brown one. If he cannot be made useful, he will be gone. Do you understand?" Valmir nodded, his jaw tight. "Yes, senor." The words carried like thunder into Sophia's heart when she overheard them. She returned to her room that night and opened her notebook. Her hand shook as she wrote, but her words were clear. "If I do nothing, he will die." Outside, Estrella cried into the night, her voice raw, her body thin with worry. The ranch lay still beneath the weight of stars, but in Sophia's heart, a storm was raging. She knew that what she chose in the days ahead would change everything, not only for Bronze, not only for Estrella, but for herself as well. The shadows of the barn had become the stage for cruelty, but they would also become the stage for defiance. And, in that defiance, a story was beginning that no amount of money or fear could silence. The morning broke with a brittle silence over Santa Helena, the kind of silence that carried weight, as if the land itself anticipated trouble. Mist still clung to the fields, curling low around the white fences, while the barns smelled of damp hay and iron. Workers moved about their chores in hushed tones, avoiding one another's eyes, as though every man sensed that something was shifting. Sophia moved quietly, her heart already heavy. Bronze had grown thinner still, his coat dulling where once it had glowed faintly under the brush of her care. His legs trembled when he rose, his eyes dark with exhaustion. She knelt in the stall beside him, her hand pressed against his muzzle. "You must hold on," she whispered, though her own voice cracked with the weight of despair. Outside, Estrella's cries had grown sharper. At dawn, her call split the air, raw and piercing, and carried across the ranch like a challenge. Workers shook their heads as they passed her paddock. Some muttered that the mare had gone mad with grief, others that her defiance would bring trouble. Only Sophia dared to meet her eyes, to offer quiet words of comfort. "He is alive. I am here. Hold on." But Estrella was no longer content to wait. Her pacing had turned restless, her muscles coiled with frustration, her eyes sharp as flint. Every day her calls had gone unanswered. And now, beneath the weight of weeks, something inside her had hardened. She pressed her body against the fence, tested the ropes with her teeth, and stomped the ground until dust rose beneath her hooves. The workers warned one another to keep their distance. Eduardo noticed too. One evening, he watched from the veranda, sipping his coffee, as Estrella reared and struck the fence with her hooves. His lips curled in disdain. "That mare has outlived her worth," he muttered. "Tomorrow she will be listed for sale. If no buyer comes, she will be sent to slaughter." The words reached Valmir, who lowered his gaze and said nothing, though his heart twisted in his chest. They reached Sophia, who overheard them as she carried feed across the yard. Her steps faltered, her breath caught, and in that moment, she knew Estrella's time was running out. She hurried back to Bronze's stall, her hands trembling as she brushed his coat. "They want to take her away," she whispered. "They want to take her from you forever." Bronze lifted his head faintly, as if he understood, his eyes glistening with the shadow of despair. That night, Sophia could not sleep. She paced her small room, her notebook open on the bed, but no words came. Instead, she listened to Estrella's distant calls, heard the way her voice tore through the darkness, and felt the weight of a decision pressing down on her. By morning, fate delivered its hand. A young worker named Toninho had been tasked with moving Estrella to the far pasture. He was careless, more interested in the buzzing of the phone in his pocket than in the strength of the mare at his lead. When he latched the gate, he failed to lock it properly. The wind pushed the gate, and Estrella felt the hinge loosen. Her ears flicked forward, her nostrils flared, and then, with a force born of desperation, she rammed her shoulder against the gate. The wood splintered, the chain clattered to the ground, and she surged forward into freedom. The ranch erupted. Shouts rang through the fields. "The mare is loose! Stop her!" But Estrella was not fleeing into the hills. She ran with purpose, her hooves pounding against the earth. Her eyes fixed on the barns where she knew her colt waited. Beto, inside Bronze's stall with a bucket of thin feed, looked up in confusion as the thunder of hooves drew near. He turned just as Estrella burst through the barn doors, her eyes burning with fury. "What the?" he shouted, dropping the bucket. Estrella did not hesitate. With a scream of rage, she drove her chest against the stall door, shattering the latch. Bronze stumbled, his thin legs shaking, but his eyes widened with sudden light as his mother's scent filled the air. Beto reached for a rope, shouting curses, but Estrella swung her head and lunged, driving him back against the wall with a force that left him gasping. She planted herself between him and her colt, her body trembling but firm, her ears pinned back, her eyes daring anyone to come closer. Bronze pressed his muzzle into her neck, his body quivering with relief. For the first time since his birth, he felt her warmth again. The barn filled with shouts. Workers rushed in, and then Eduardo himself stormed through the door, his sunglasses flashing in the dim light. "What is this chaos?" he bellowed. He stopped short at the sight before him. Estrella, standing tall in defiance, her colt pressed against her side. Beto wheezing against the boards. Sophia was standing in the corner, her eyes wide but unflinching. Eduardo's face darkened. "Enough," he growled. "That mare will be sold tomorrow. To hell with the buyers. Send her to the abattoir, and as for the colt, leave him. He is nothing, let him rot." Sophia's heart lurched. Without thinking, she stepped forward. "You cannot do this," she said, her voice breaking but strong. Eduardo turned to her, his gaze sharp as a blade. "I can do whatever I please. This is my ranch, my land, my animals." But Sophia did not back down. Her fists clenched at her sides, her whole body trembling. She looked from Estrella to Bronze and felt the vow she had made burning inside her. "If you sell her, if you let him die, then everything you pretend to build here is a lie." The workers shifted uneasily, but none spoke. Eduardo sneered. "You are a child," he spat. "Do your work or leave this place." Sophia lowered her gaze, swallowing her tears, but inside, a decision had crystallized. She would not wait for another chance. She would not let Eduardo's cruelty be the final word. That night, she would act. As dusk fell, Estrella was returned to her paddock under heavy chains, her body restless, her eyes never leaving the barns where her colt remained. Bronze collapsed in his stall, exhausted. But for the first time in weeks, he slept against the lingering scent of his mother. Sophia returned to her room with her notebook clutched to her chest. By the light of a single candle, she wrote her plan. "Tomorrow, they will separate them forever. Tonight, I will set them free." The ranch was quiet outside, the workers already asleep, But the land itself seemed to pulse with expectation. The cries of Estrella had been silenced, but not broken. In the barns, Bronze stirred in his sleep, as though sensing that something greater was about to come. And Sophia, sitting in her small room with her pen scratching across the page, felt the weight of destiny pressing against her shoulders. The mare's fury had lit the spark. Now it was up to her to fan it into flame. The ranch fell into darkness beneath a sky spattered with stars. But for Sophia the night was anything but calm. Her hands trembled as she folded her notebook and slid it beneath her pillow. The words she had written still burned in her mind, words that carried no turning back. Tonight she would act, for if dawn arrived with nothing done, Eduardo would separate Bronze from Estrella forever. She paced the narrow floor of her small room, every creak of the board sounding like thunder in her ears. From outside drifted the steady hum of crickets, the occasional bark of a dog, and far away, the restless stomp of hooves from the paddocks. Estrella had grown quieter since the afternoon's fury, but her silence was heavy, the silence of a storm gathering strength. Sophia gathered what little she had. A wool blanket she had found forgotten in a storage chest, a pair of worn lead ropes, and a half-empty canteen. From the tack room, she had earlier borrowed a rusted padlock key given in secret by Valmir, who had not dared speak words of encouragement, but whose eyes had betrayed his complicity. "Use it wisely," he had whispered before turning away. By the time the ranch had gone still, Sophia slipped from her room, her breath catching in her throat as she stepped into the night. Every shadow seemed alive, every gust of wind like a voice warning her to turn back. Yet she pressed forward, her boots whispering against the dirt path as she made her way toward the back barns. Inside, Bronze lay curled against the boards, his sides rising and falling with shallow breaths. His body looked so frail, so breakable, that for a moment Sophia's resolve wavered. Could he even survive the journey she planned for him? She crouched beside him, her hand brushing his muzzle, and whispered, "Tonight we leave this place. Tonight you are not alone." Bronze stirred, lifting his head weakly, his eyes flickering at the sound of her voice. Sophia wrapped the blanket around him, careful not to startle him, and tied the rope loosely around his neck. She had no plan for what came after, only the certainty that anything beyond these walls was better than the slow death Eduardo intended. Estrella waited in her paddock, her eyes catching the moonlight as Sophia approached. The mare nickered softly, stamping her hooves against the earth. Sophia pressed a hand to her flank, whispering, "I am bringing him to you. You must stay quiet, just until we reach the gate." Estrella's ears flicked back, her breath heavy against Sophia's hand, as if she understood. Together they moved toward the northern fence where the lock waited. Sophia's heart hammered as she slid the key into the rusted metal. It turned with a groan that echoed too loudly in the stillness, and she froze, listening. No footsteps, no voices. She pushed the gate open and guided Estrella through, Bronze stumbling at her side. The night stretched before them, vast and uncertain. The road to freedom lay ahead, but so did discovery. Every step was a gamble, every sound a threat. Yet Sophia felt no fear now, only a strange calm that came with the certainty of sacrifice. Behind them the ranch slept in ignorance. Eduardo dreamed of profits, Beto of control. Valmir of ghosts he had never banished. None of them knew that within the shadows of the night, a girl, a mare, and a frail colt had bound their fates together in a single vow. They would not return. And as the gate swung shut behind them with a final metallic click, Sophia knew the oath she had spoken in her notebook had come alive. This was the moment the story would change forever. The night carried them forward like a secret the earth itself wanted to protect. Sophia gripped the rope tied loosely around Bronze's neck, while her other hand pressed against Estrella's shoulder to guide her along the narrow dirt path. The blanket still clung to the colt, though it slipped as he stumbled over roots and uneven ground. Each faltering step made Sophia's heart ache, yet he pressed on, driven by the nearness of his mother, whose presence gave him strength he no longer had alone. The moon hung low, a pale guardian over the land, silvering the grass and glinting off the fences that marked the edges of Eduardo's domain. Every sound seemed magnified in the silence. The creak of the wagon wheel tracks, the labored breaths of the animals, the pounding of Sophia's heart. She feared each rustle might be a worker stirring, each bark from a distant dog the alarm that would ruin everything. Far off, the ranch lay quiet, its buildings crouched in shadow. Eduardo's house loomed at the center, its lights extinguished, its master unaware that his empire was being unraveled in the dark. Bronze staggered again, his legs folding slightly before Estrella nudged him upright with her muzzle. Sophia whispered encouragements, her voice low and steady. "You can do this, just a little farther." She felt the trembling of his body through the rope, yet there was also determination, the kind born from instinct, from the bond with his mother. At the edge of the north pasture, a figure emerged from the shadows. Sophia froze, pulling Estrella back while clutching Bronze close. But it was Valmir, his old face lined with tension, his hands shoved into his pockets as though to hide their shaking. He stepped forward silently and nodded toward the open gate. "Go," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You will not get another chance." Sophia wanted to speak, to thank him, but the words tangled in her throat. She only nodded, her eyes meeting his, and in that look passed all the gratitude she could not say aloud. Valmir turned away, shoulders hunched, and disappeared into the dark, leaving her path open. They passed through the gate, the fields widening before them. The road lay beyond, a ribbon of pale dust leading toward the promise of freedom. But freedom was not silent. Behind them, a dog barked, sharp and frantic. Another joined in, then another, until the air was filled with the alarm of teeth and sound. Lights flickered on at the far end of the ranch, voices shouting, doors slamming. "Run," Sophia whispered, tugging gently at Bronze while Estrella surged forward. The colt stumbled but followed, spurred by the urgency in his mother's stride. Their hooves struck the earth in uneven rhythm, their shadows flying across the ground as the barking grew louder. Beto's voice rose above the others, harsh and furious. "They are escaping. Stop them." Torches flared in the distance, men running toward the barns, confusion scattering them like ants. Sophia's chest burned with fear, yet her grip on the rope tightened. She pushed forward, every muscle in her body screaming with effort. The road was closed now, the sound of a truck engine rumbling faintly ahead. João, the driver, had promised to wait. The barking grew nearer, the thud of boots closing in. Bronze faltered again, his body nearly collapsing. Sophia cried out, scooping her arms beneath his neck and heaving upward with all the strength she had left. Estrella pressed against them, shielding them with her body, her eyes blazing in the moonlight. At last, they reached the road. João stood by the truck, the back ramp lowered, his face pale but determined. Quickly he urged, waving them on. Sophia guided Estrella up first. The mare climbed with surprising calm, as though she knew safety lay within. Bronze followed clumsily, his legs dragging, until Sophia and João lifted him together. When at last the colt collapsed onto the straw in the truck bed, Sophia felt her own legs weaken with relief. João slammed the doors shut, the metal ringing out like a final drumbeat. He leapt into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life just as lights from the ranch broke over the hill. The truck lurched forward, tires spitting gravel as it surged onto the open road. Shouts carried after them, furious and desperate, but the distance widened with every turn of the wheels. Sophia clung to the side rail, her hair whipping in the wind, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and triumph. Inside the truck, Estrella stood over her colt, her body curved protectively, her breath steady against his trembling flank. Bronze lifted his head weakly, his eyes meeting Sophia's through the small gap in the boards, and in that gaze was the spark of something new, hope, fragile but alive. Behind them, Santa Helena faded into the distance, its fences shrinking against the night. Eduardo would soon learn of the escape. His fury would thunder across the valley, and his power would not let the matter rest. But for now, in the trembling quiet of the flight, Sophia allowed herself a single truth: they were free. And though the road ahead would be fraught with danger, though shadows of pursuit already stretched toward them, the oath she had made was no longer words on a page. It was living, breathing, galloping into the unknown night. The truck roared through the night, its headlights slicing the darkness into fleeting fragments of light and shadow. Sophia clung to the side rail of the cab, her body swaying with each jolt of the uneven road. Inside the truck bed, Estrella stood tall, her frame tense but steady as she shielded Bronze beneath her chest. The colt lay curled against her, the blanket slipping from his thin body, his eyes closed in exhausted surrender. Every bump threatened to throw him off balance, but his mother's presence held him steady. João kept his gaze fixed on the road ahead, his hands tight around the wheel. The old driver had promised help, but even he could not hide the strain of the moment. His jaw clenched, his eyes flicking toward the mirrors with every mile. "They are not far behind," he muttered, though his words were almost lost in the growl of the engine. Sophia leaned closer, her heart hammering. "You think they are following already?" "I know," João replied. "A man like that does not sleep when he smells rebellion. His men will ride, maybe even the police. Money buys speed." The words sank into Sophia's chest like ice, but she forced herself to breathe. Bronze stirred weakly in the back, his ears twitching as though sensing the fear that wrapped the air. She glanced at him through the wooden slats and whispered, "Hold on, little one. We are almost there." The road wound through valleys where mist rose like ghosts from the earth. Each turn seemed to stretch into eternity, each rise in the terrain threatening to expose them to watchful eyes. João drove with determination, but the weight of the pursuit pressed heavier with every passing minute. Sophia thought of Valmir, standing at the gate with his face half lost in shadow. His silence had been an act of courage, his gift of the key a betrayal of the man who paid his wages. Would he be safe now, or would Eduardo's wrath consume him as well? She bit her lip until she tasted blood, guilt, and fear tangled in her chest. Behind them, far on the horizon, the faint glow of headlights appeared. They were distant, but they were not still. They were moving, hunting, gaining ground. João cursed under his breath and pressed harder on the accelerator. The truck rattled, its old frame groaning under the strain, but it surged forward with every ounce of strength it had left. Sophia held on tighter, her knuckles white against the rail. The chase had begun. Estrella tossed her head inside the truck, snorting as though she too sensed the danger. She shifted her weight protectively over Bronze, her eyes flashing in the pale light. Sophia felt a surge of admiration for the mare, her strength, her fury, her unyielding devotion. If the world needed proof of the bond between mother and child, Estrella carried it in every breath, every movement, every defiant step. The road narrowed, flanked by thick stands of eucalyptus that whispered in the wind. João leaned forward, scanning the way ahead. "We must reach the crossing before dawn," he said. "If we can get to the old quarry, there are men waiting. But if they catch us before then," his words trailed off, leaving only the growl of the engine and the pounding of Sophia's heart to fill the silence. Sophia turned her eyes toward the back again, to the fragile figure of Bronze. His ribs still showed, his body fragile, yet in his eyes there was something alive, a flicker of trust that had begun to grow since she first touched him. That trust was now her anchor, the reason she could not falter, could not surrender. The headlights behind them grew brighter. The hunters were closer. The air filled with the thrum of engines, the sound of men determined to drag them back. João spat into the wind and pushed the truck harder. "Hold on, girl," he shouted. "Tonight decides everything." Sophia held on. Bronze held on. Estrella stood like a fortress. And in that moment, with the night tearing past them and the dawn creeping closer, Sophia knew that this was no longer just a rescue. It was a war between cruelty and compassion, between greed and love, between a man who thought money could buy everything and a girl who had nothing but her will. The road stretched on, dark and merciless, but ahead there was still hope. The chase in the dark had only begun. The truck rattled onward, its frame groaning as if it too carried the burden of the chase. The headlights behind them refused to fade. They dipped and rose with the bends of the road, their beams slicing through the night like blades. Sophia clutched the side rail, her knuckles white, her mind racing with prayers that the old vehicle would hold together long enough to outpace Eduardo's men. Inside the bed, Estrella braced herself with powerful legs, her mane whipping in the wind, her body bent like a shield around Bronze. The colt trembled but did not collapse. He pressed his muzzle against her flank, drawing strength from her warmth. The fear in his eyes was real, but so was the spark of endurance that Sophia had seen growing day by day. It was as though the promise of freedom itself kept him moving. João drove with his jaw set and eyes locked on the road. His weathered hands gripped the wheel with a steadiness that belied the pounding of his heart. Each curve was taken with precision, each stretch of open road devoured with desperate speed. He had promised to help, but even he had not foreseen the ferocity of Eduardo's pursuit. The barking of dogs echoed faintly behind them, carried on the wind, mingling with the roar of engines. Men shouted in the distance, their voices blurred but urgent. They were gaining ground. Sofia turned toward João, her hair whipping across her face. What if they catch us? João spat through the window, never loosening his grip. Then we make sure they regret it. But we will not let them take the colt. The words burned in Sofia's ears. She thought of Valmir, of his tired eyes when he had pressed the key into her palm. He had known what it meant. He had known the storm would come. Now she carried not just her vow, but his as well. The road narrowed as it bent around a ravine, the ground falling sharply into darkness below. João downshifted, the truck growling as it climbed the steep incline. Behind them, the headlights flared brighter. The pursuers had reached the same curve, their engines roaring like a pack of wolves in full chase. Sofia's breath caught. They are too close. Estrella slammed her hooves against the truck bed, her eyes wild, as though she too knew the danger. Bronze lifted his head weakly, his ears twitching at the sounds of pursuit. The incline leveled, and João pushed the accelerator hard. The truck leapt forward, rattling as though it might come apart. For a moment, the distance widened, the headlights shrinking in the mirror. Sofia felt hope surge, brief, bright, and fragile. But then a shot cracked the night. The sound was sharp, echoing off the cliffs, and Sofia ducked instinctively. Estrella reared within the truck, whinnying in fury, her body crashing against the walls. Bronze collapsed against the straw, his eyes wide with terror. "They are firing at us," Sofia cried, her voice raw. João's face was grim. "Then we drive faster. Hold on." He pressed the pedal to the floor, the truck screaming as it tore down the road. The headlights behind them wavered but did not vanish. Another shot rang out, this time striking the tailgate with a metallic clang. Estrella shrieked, her eyes burning, her body trembling with rage rather than fear. Sofia pressed herself to the slats, shouting through the wind. "Hold on, Estrella. Protect him. Just a little longer." The road widened again, opening into a stretch where the fields spread flat and the moon shone bright. In the distance, Sofia saw the faint outline of the quarry João had spoken of. Her heart leapt. That is it. That is the place. João's eyes flicked toward it, his jaw tightening. If we reach the quarry, we may have a chance. Men are waiting there, people who will not bow to Eduardo. But the headlights behind them flared once more, closer than ever, and the growl of engines filled the night air like thunder rolling across the hills. The hunters were nearly upon them, relentless, unstoppable. Sofia clutched the rail until her hands ached. This was more than a chase now. It was a battle between two worlds, between cruelty and compassion, between the iron grip of wealth and the fragile but fierce power of love. Estrella stamped her hooves, Bronze pressed against her, and Sofia whispered a vow into the rushing wind. "We will not go back, not now, not ever." The storm of justice had begun, and there would be no silence until it was finished. The quarry loomed ahead like a jagged mouth carved into the earth, its cliffs stark against the faint light of the approaching dawn. The air grew colder as João guided the truck down the gravel path that wound toward its entrance. The sound of pursuit still roared behind them, engines grinding and dogs howling, but the sight of the quarry brought a sliver of hope to Sofia's chest. This was the place João had promised, the place where help might be waiting. Bronze stirred weakly in the truck bed, his ribs heaving with every breath. Estrella pressed her flank against him, her body a fortress of warmth and determination. She tossed her head toward the approaching headlights, her ears pinned, her eyes burning as if daring the world to try to take her son again. Sofia leaned close to João. "Will they really be there?" "They will," João said firmly, though the tightness in his voice betrayed the strain of faith. "They know what this fight means. They know what Eduardo has done." The truck rattled down the path, its wheels spitting stones into the night. The quarry opened wide before them, a hollow that once echoed with the sounds of pickaxes and labor but now stood empty, waiting. Empty except for the faint glow of lanterns. Figures emerged from the shadows, Men and women with weathered faces, holding ropes, boards, and makeshift tools. They moved quickly, signaling to João. He swung the truck around, bringing it to a halt near the edge. The doors flew open, and the rescuers rushed to help. "Get the mare and the colt out," one of them shouted quickly, "before they arrive." Sophia leapt down, her legs buckling from exhaustion, but her spirit surging. She helped guide Estrella down the ramp, Bronze stumbling after her with trembling legs. The rescuers gathered around them, forming a wall of bodies between the animals and the mouth of the road. The headlights appeared moments later, blinding in the dimness. Engines roared as Eduardo's men stormed into the quarry, their shouts filling the air like the calls of a hunting pack. Beto was at the front, his face twisted with fury, his hand clutching a rope like a weapon. "Return what you stole," he bellowed. "You cannot run from the master." Sophia stepped forward, her body trembling but her eyes unflinching. "They are not his. They are not property." Laughter rippled among the pursuers, harsh and bitter. "And who are you, girl, to stand against a man like Eduardo?" Before Sophia could answer, one of the rescuers raised his lantern high. His voice rang clear across the quarry. "She is not alone. We stand with her." The rescuers tightened their formation, their tools held firm, their faces set with the steel of conviction. Behind them, Estrella stamped the ground, her muscles rippling, her eyes blazing. Bronze leaned into her side, frail but alive, his gaze fixed on the light. Beto sneered, but hesitation flickered in his stance. There were many rescuers, and their resolve was fierce. He barked orders, his men stepping forward, but the standoff held, heavy as thunder before a storm. Then, from the ridge above, another voice rang out. "Halt!" All eyes turned as the beam of a flashlight cut across the quarry. Uniformed figures descended the slope, police, led by Delegata Helena. Her stern face was lit by the rising sun, her voice carrying the weight of law. "We have received reports of cruelty and abuse," she declared. "We have evidence in hand." Sophia's heart leapt. The videos she had recorded, the proof she had carried in her trembling hands, had reached the authorities. She stepped forward, raising her phone high. "It is all here. Every blow, every cruelty." The rescuers murmured, their resolve hardening. Eduardo's men faltered, their bravado draining beneath the glare of the law. Beto spat, but his defiance wavered. "This is not finished." "No," Sophia said, her voice steady now. "It has only begun." The dawn broke fully over the quarry, painting the cliffs in gold. Estrella stood tall, bronze pressed against her, and for the first time since his birth, the colt lifted his head without fear. The storm of pursuit had led them here, to this hollow carved by labor and silence. But now it was filled with voices, with truth, with the first stirrings of justice. And as the light spread across the land, Sophia knew they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The fight for Bronze and Estrella was no longer hers alone. It belonged to all who had gathered, to all who had heard their cries, to all who would no longer look away. The quarry of truth had spoken, and its echo would not be silenced. The quarry emptied slowly as dawn claimed the sky. Police surrounded Eduardo's men. Their weapons were holstered, but their presence was undeniable. Beto cursed beneath his breath as he was restrained, his glare cutting through the dust-filled air toward Sophia. His fury promised revenge, but his hands were bound, and for the first time, his cruelty was powerless. Estrella and Bronze were led to a sheltered pen by the rescuers. The mare stood firm, eyes sharp and nostrils flaring as she watched every movement, unwilling to let her colt be taken from her again. Bronze leaned against her, his frail body still trembling, but his head lifted, his gaze following Sophia wherever she moved. In his eyes there was a fragile spark, one that told her he recognized the promise she had kept. Delegata Helena approached, her boots crunching over gravel. She fixed Sophia with a steady look. "Your courage brought us here, but this fight is not over. Eduardo's power does not end at his fences. It reaches courts and politicians. You must be ready for what comes next." Sophia nodded, her throat dry, but her resolve unshaken. "I will not stop." Within days, the story spread across the region. The video Sophia had captured was shared on radios, in newspapers, across the glowing screens of cell phones. People saw the trembling colt, the fury of Estrella, the brutality of Beto's blows. Outrage grew, and with it, the first cracks in Eduardo's empire. The courtroom in São João del Rei was filled with faces on the day of the hearing. Farmers, workers, journalists, animal advocates, everyone wanted to see justice given a voice. Eduardo sat at the front, his polished suit a shield, his gaze hidden behind the dark glasses that had always concealed his contempt. He denied everything, his voice smooth and practiced. "Lies," he said, "manipulations. I have always cared for my animals." But Sophia stood, her heart pounding, and spoke. She told of the nights spent whispering to Bronze, of the blows she had seen with her own eyes, of the cries of Estrella echoing across the fields. She presented her videos, her trembling hand holding the phone that had captured truth in its purest form. Valmir followed. His voice was tired but strong. He admitted to years of silence, of watching cruelty unfold without the courage to act. His testimony was a confession, but also a plea for change. "I should have spoken sooner," he said, "but I will speak now." Then came Marcos, the former worker who had returned with his diary and photographs. Page after page revealed the hidden history of neglect, the buried stories of animals cast aside. The weight of his words pressed into the courtroom until even Eduardo's lawyers struggled to defend him. The judge listened, her eyes stern and her voice clear. The evidence was overwhelming. The verdict rang like thunder. Eduardo Villela was stripped of his rights to manage the ranch, his fortune placed under scrutiny, his legacy tainted by cruelty. The animals would be transferred to sanctuaries, safe from his grasp. The crowd erupted. Some cheered, others wept. Sophia stood in the middle of it all, her body trembling with exhaustion, her eyes fixed on Estrella and Bronze, waiting outside in the sunlight. When she stepped into the courtyard, Bronze nickered softly, stumbling forward until his muzzle pressed into her hand. Estrella lowered her head beside him, her breath warm against her skin. Sophia sank to her knees, tears streaming freely. "We did it," she whispered. "You are free now." But in her heart, she knew freedom was more than this single victory. It was a seed, planted in the soil of outrage and nurtured by compassion. It would need care, protection, and voices louder than cruelty to grow. That night, as Bronze slept in the safety of the sanctuary pasture with Estrella close by, Sophia sat beneath the stars with her notebook open. Her words filled the page like a vow renewed. "We saved them. But this is only the beginning." The trial of shadows had ended, but a new journey was just beginning. The sanctuary lay nestled in a valley where the hills rolled soft and green, where the wind carried scents of wildflowers instead of dust and rot, where fences did not confine but merely guided. It was here that Estrella and Bronze found the first true rest of their lives. The pasture stretched wide beneath the sun, dotted with shade trees and gentle streams. And for the first time since Bronze had stumbled into the world, his hooves touched ground that did not echo with despair. Sophia stood at the fence, her eyes tracing their every movement. Estrella trotted across the pasture with a grace renewed, her mane flying free, her body alive with energy she had long buried under chains and grief. Bronze, still thin and fragile, followed clumsily at her side, his steps awkward yet determined. Each stumble was met with Estrella's patient nudge, and each falter was met with her guiding presence. Watching them, Sophia felt a warmth bloom in her chest that no victory in the courtroom could match. This was freedom in its purest form. Freedom not written on paper, but written in the gleam of a colt's eyes and the joyous cry of a mare reunited with her child. She leaned against the fence post, her notebook clutched to her chest, and whispered to herself, "This is why it mattered." Word of the trial had spread far and wide. Newspapers carried headlines of cruelty unmasked, of justice finally breaking through the shadow of wealth. Photographs of Bronze, once trembling in the dark stalls, now walking in sunlight, were shared across towns and cities. People who had never cared for horses before spoke of him, wrote of him, debated about him. He had become more than a colt. He was a symbol, a story that had struck the hearts of thousands. But with recognition came danger. Eduardo's fortune had been wounded but not destroyed. His allies whispered in corridors. His lawyers drafted appeals. His pride festered like an untreated wound. He spoke rarely now, but when he did, his words carried venom. He would not forgive. He would not forget. Sophia knew this. She felt it in the way some eyes lingered on her in town, in the hushed warnings from those who had once worked for Eduardo. Yet she did not bend. Her days were spent at the sanctuary, caring for Bronze, tending to Estrella, and helping with the other animals who had been rescued from similar fates. At night, she wrote in her notebook, her words no longer the whispers of despair, but the outlines of a vision larger than herself. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the sky in crimson and gold, Sophia walked into the pasture. Estrella lifted her head, ears flicking forward, and Bronze trotted clumsily toward her. He was stronger now, his coat was beginning to shine with health, and his eyes were brighter with curiosity. He pressed his muzzle into her hands, searching her pockets for the carrots she always carried. She laughed softly, tears pricking her eyes at the sound of his eager snorts. Kneeling, she stroked his neck, feeling the strength that was finally growing there. "You were meant for this," she whispered. "Not darkness, not cruelty. You were meant for the light." Estrella moved closer, pressing her muzzle against Sophia's shoulder, as though thanking her not just for Bronze, but for herself as well. In that moment, Sophia felt a bond greater than words, a bond forged through suffering and sealed in love. The weeks passed, and Bronze grew. His legs steadied, his trot became smoother, and his playful spirit emerged. He chased butterflies across the pasture, splashed clumsily in the stream, and sometimes nudged Sophia so insistently she had to laugh through her tears. Each day was a step away from the shadow of Eduardo, a step into the dignity that had been stolen from him at birth. But Sophia knew the fight was not over. Justice had been won in the courts, but true change required more than a verdict. It required voices, stories, and unyielding persistence. She began to speak at gatherings, to share Bronze's story with others. She held up photographs of the colt in his weakest days, then photographs of him now, running free. Each time she spoke, she saw faces change, eyes soften, hands rise in support. "We cannot be silent," she told them. "Silence is what allows cruelty to thrive." Silence is what nearly killed him. And the people listened. At the sanctuary, visitors arrived in greater numbers. Children pressed their hands against the fences, wide-eyed as Bronze trotted by, their laughter ringing like bells. Farmers asked questions, wanting to learn how to treat their animals with more care. Volunteers offered time and labor. The story of Bronze and Estrella had become a movement, one that grew beyond the valley, beyond the town, reaching hearts Sophia had never imagined. Still, in the quiet of the night, when the world hushed and only the wind stirred through the grass, Sophia sometimes thought of Eduardo. She thought of the darkness in his eyes, the coldness in his voice, the way power had twisted him into a man who saw life only in terms of profit. She wondered if he had ever felt even a fragment of the love she now saw between Estrella and Bronze. Perhaps not. Perhaps that was why he had lost. One late evening, as stars scattered across the sky, Sophia sat outside the pasture with her notebook open. The moonlight glowed faintly on the page as she wrote. "We gave them back their dignity, and in doing so, we gave it back to ourselves." The journey had begun in shadows, in cruelty, in silence. But here, under the vast expanse of sky, with Estrella grazing peacefully and Bronze trotting beside her with a joy that needed no words, Sophia felt the truth settle deep within her. The fight for justice was never just about punishment. It was about restoration, about giving back what should never have been taken, about ensuring that no creature would be left voiceless in the dark again. And as the night deepened, as the world turned quietly on its axis, Sophia knew one thing with absolute certainty. The return of dignity was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning of something greater, something that would echo far beyond the hills of Santa Helena, something that would live wherever compassion found a home. The valley was quiet in the golden haze of late afternoon. The sanctuary fields stretched wide, their grass swaying gently in the breeze, their streams glimmering with reflected light. Estrella grazed peacefully near the oak trees, her mane brushing against her neck in the soft wind. Bronze, no longer frail and trembling, trotted circles around her, his strides steadier, his body filling with strength, his spirit unbound. Sophia leaned on the wooden fence, her notebook open in her hands, though for a long time she simply stared. The colt she had once cradled in her arms when he could barely stand now ran with the joy of life itself. Every step he took was a defiance of the cruelty that had nearly destroyed him. Every toss of his head, every playful nudge at his mother, was proof that love had conquered what greed and violence had tried to claim. Visitors came more often now. Families stood by the fences with wide eyes, children laughing as Bronze flicked his tail and darted across the pasture. Farmers asked questions about care, about gentleness, about the changes they, too, could make. Teachers brought students to listen to the story of Estrella and her colt, a story that was no longer just about animals, but about the value of every life and the responsibility of every hand. Sophia spoke when asked, her voice steady though her heart still trembled with memory. She told of the nights in the dark barns, of the blows Bronze had endured, of Estrella's cries that had cut through silence. She told of Valmir's tired courage, of Marcos's secret diary, of the courtroom where truth had finally been heard. But most of all, she told of love, the love of a mother who broke chains, the love of a girl who refused to turn away. Each telling seemed to plant another seed. The sanctuary grew not just in numbers but in purpose. Volunteers arrived with tools and strong hands, donations poured in from distant towns, and with every new arrival, Sophia felt the weight of her vow deepen. Bronze and Estrella had been saved, but there were countless others still waiting in shadows, countless cries still unheard. At night, when the valley hushed and only the stars remained, Sophia sat by the pasture with her notebook open. Bronze often lay nearby, his head resting on Estrella's flank, his breathing slow and steady. Sophia would write by lantern light, her words spilling across the page like promises. We will not stop, for every Bronze, for every Estrella, for every life caught in silence. We will keep fighting. The wind would lift her hair, carrying her words across the fields. Sometimes she imagined they reached beyond the hills, beyond the valley, carried to places where cruelty still reigned, where voices still needed courage. And, though Eduardo's shadow still lingered in distant whispers, though his pride plotted even in defeat, Sophia no longer feared him. His empire had cracked, and from those cracks light had poured through. He could not undo what had been done, could not erase the sight of Bronze running free beneath the sun. One evening, as twilight settled, João arrived at the sanctuary. His old truck coughed dust on the road, but his eyes were warm as he leaned against the fence beside Sophia. "Look at him," he said, nodding toward Bronze. "That is what victory looks like." Sophia smiled, though her eyes shimmered with tears. "No," she said softly, "that is what dignity looks like." They stood in silence, watching as Bronze galloped across the field, Estrella's steady figure always near, her presence still his anchor. It was a sight that no amount of wealth could buy, no cruelty could erase. It was life, resilient and unbroken. As the stars emerged one by one, Sophia closed her notebook with a final line written clearly and boldly. The story does not end here. It begins again each time we choose compassion over cruelty, each time we listen to the voiceless, each time we stand when silence would be easier. The legacy of compassion had been born in shadows, but now it stretched wide beneath the open sky. And as Bronze lifted his head and whinnied into the night, his voice carried not just across the valley, but into the hearts of all who would hear. It was no longer just the story of a mare and her colt. It was the story of every life waiting to be seen, every bond waiting to be honored, every injustice waiting to be undone. The legacy was alive. It would live on as long as love was stronger than fear.